We often get questions about the 3DConnexion devices and how some of the navigation you see in many of our videos is achieved. This video is going to focus on the 3DConnexion Space Mouse Enterprise, but similar settings and configurations can be used for the other 3DConnexion devices. To start, go to the 3DConnexion website and download the latest drivers for your device on your operating system. Once the install of the driver is complete, make sure to restart your machine and then plug in the device. Upon restart, you should be prompted with the 3DConnexion Home dialog. If you're not, you can launch this in the 3DConnexion application folder. Before we jump into Vectorworks and all the settings there, I recommend going through the trainer. This is a quick overview of the device. Once we finish the trainer, we're going to go to the Properties option on the 3DConnexion Home. This is where we'll find all the settings and configure the device for Vectorworks. Begin by clicking the Configure drop-down at the top and choose Vectorworks. This will give us a good starting point. It should be noted that I'm going to go over my preferred settings here. Under the Device tab, we'll find an overall speed option at the bottom. I find the default speed too fast. I turn mine down to around the second tick mark. The dominant checkbox restricts certain rotations to a single axis. You'll generally want to leave this unchecked. We'll now go to the Axes tab. These settings will allow you to adjust the mapping for each of the actions completed in the trainer. In Vectorworks, we don't use roll, so I would generally recommend setting this to disable. The other mapping settings found here are generally the settings I want, but I want to touch on the options at the bottom here for threshold and speed. Threshold is how far I need to move the cap in order for it to register my action. If the slider's to the left, a slight touch to the cap in that direction will start the action. If the slider's further to the right, it will require the cap to be pushed more in that direction before it starts that action. By default, these are to the left. I'd recommend adjusting these to around the midpoint of the slider. The speed slider is going to take your overall speed set under the Device tab and adjust it individually for each mapping option. For now, I would leave these centered as well. We're now going to look at the buttons. In this tab, we'll find a list of all the buttons on the left side of the column. If you look at the Enterprise, you'll find that certain buttons share a physical button. Here, button R and button L are sharing the same button. If you press the button quickly, it will use button R, and if you hold the button down, it will use button L. For each button, you can map it to a specific command, tool, or function. Most of the default settings are what I would recommend. The main settings here that you'll want to customize for your workflow are the button 1 through button 12 options. I'm going to select button 1. At the bottom, let's look at the mapping options first. I'm only going to be covering the mapping options that you'll likely use for Vectorworks. In the 3DConnexion manual, you can find additional information on all of these settings and options. Application command is where you'll find about 50 tools for Vectorworks that are already programmed to work. You can select options here such as the selection tool, wall tool, line tool, and different standard views. For button 1, you'll set the mapping to application command, and then set the application command to the 2D polygon tool as an example. For button 2, we'll explore running a macro. For this, we have to swap over to the Macros tab. To start, we'll go to Vectorworks and locate the tool that we want to map. In this example, I want to map the Window tool and locate its shortcut, Shift-Option-W. You can customize your shortcuts through the Vectorworks workspace editor, in the case of a tool that doesn't have a default shortcut applied. Back in the 3DConnexion interface, start by clicking the plus icon in the window to the left. This will give us a location to name the macro. In this example, we'll call it Window Tool. To the right, we can add notes if we want. Now at the bottom, I'll add the macro steps. In this case, I'm going to choose a keystroke. I then highlight where it says None and press the shortcut. Back in the Button tab, we can now map button 2 to Run Macro and choose the Window Tool macro that we created just a moment ago. Now we'll look at radio menus. Go to the Radio Menus tab along the top. This has similar mapping options in the bottom left to the options for the buttons. On the right side of this window, we can set up a radio menu with 4 different commands. In this example, I set up one for wall-related tools. We can now go back to the Buttons tab and map button 3 to this radio menu. We'll now open a new Vectorworks file to take a look at these example settings that we just configured. In this new file, I'll start by pressing button 1, which will bring up the 2D polygon tool, and we'll create a rectangle. Now, we use button 3 on the Space Navigator to bring up our radio menu of wall tools. We will use the wall tool to trace the rectangle. We'll now use our button 2 on the Space Navigator to place a few windows into the walls. We can now use the cap on the 3DConnexion device to rotate around the drawing. By default, there's a button in the bottom right of the Enterprise for ISO 1 and then Fit. We can use this to rotate into 3D easily. In an orthogonal projection, we'll rotate around the origin point of the drawing. While this can work, we generally want to use these in a perspective view. For additional information and tips on using the 3DConnexion device, check out 3DConnexion's website, manual, and YouTube channel.